Test, test, check, test, mic 1. Test.
You know what, it's low, but the other day it was sort of low when I went up and I got killed.
You're blasted. Check, check, mic 2. Check, check. Mic check 3. Check, check.
Witness mic check 1, witness mic check 2. Second mic check, test, test, test. Member mic test, member mic check, 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 test, test, test.
stayed at the facility and rode the storm out to protect and secure the inmate population. They stayed and carried out our mission, not knowing if their families were safe or if their houses still stood. The storm caused over $30 million in damage, including significant roof damage and destruction of most of the perimeter fencing. Due to the extent of the damage to the facility and to the local area, we moved the inmates out of the facility and did so in less than 2 days. Staff moved all 1,200 inmates from an area that had no power, on difficult road conditions, during day and night, with little to no outside agency assistance. We did that with not a single injury or breach of security. Many staff at Marietta and elsewhere across the South lost all they had. Tragically, one staff member in Petersburg, Virginia, lost her brother and mother in floodwaters from the storm. I traveled to Florida to assess the damage and to support our staff there. Pictures and news reports do not do justice to the magnitude of the damage that I saw. I drove through neighborhoods where many of our staff lived. I saw homes with trees slicing through the middle of them. The devastation was unbelievable. BOP staff across the agency recognize the challenges required in managing facilities safely. When hardships arise, they stand ready to provide support. As such, staff from across the country volunteered to help repair Marietta. They manned the facilities that housed the relocated inmates, and many donated funds to help their coworkers in need. This is the spirit of the Bureau of Prisons staff. They are laser-focused on achieving our mission to safely and securely confine offenders as we prepare to return them to society. Unfortunately, this wasn't the first time we experienced such events, and it won't be the last. The dedication that I witnessed firsthand reminds me of how proud I am to sit before this committee and represent the men and women of the Bureau of Prisons. I am proud of the work they do, the sacrifices they make, and the risks they take every day. Chairman Gowdy, Congresswoman Maloney, and members of the committee, this concludes my formal statement, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Director Hurwitz. We'll recognize the gentlelady from New York for her opening, and then we will recognize the gentleman from Ohio to kick off our questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to note that members on the Democratic side are juggling a lot of very important organizational meetings, and we are literally voting for the leadership of our caucus today. We will do our best to be here, but please do not take our scheduling conflicts with the timing of this hearing as any indication of our commitment to this issue. We care deeply about the topic of today's hearing and will continue to work on this and other prison reform and criminal justice issues. With that, I want to thank the chairman for calling the hearing to discuss the troubling gaps in the care for female inmates in our country and much-needed reform to our country's prison system. Director Hurwitz and IG Horowitz, I appreciate your taking the time to be here today to address these important issues. Mr. Horowitz, the report you issued in September was extremely troubling. It expressed serious gaps in treatment and services for women in prison. Your office has been highlighting problems in federal and private prisons for years, and I applaud your commitment to pushing our government to do much better. The Obama administration strengthened policies for managing and treating female inmates in 2016 when the Bureau of Prisons issued the Female Offender Manual. The new report Mr. Horowitz released, however, documents how the Trump administration is not fully implementing these new policies. The IG's report finds that only 3% of female inmates are provided treatment for trauma, even though at least 90% of incarcerated women are suffering from trauma. Women who want help are left to wait months or years for even basic access to trauma-related treatment, if they receive it at all, because there is only one staff person assigned to each facility to implement the trauma program. The IG also finds that the Bureau of Prisons is not providing new mothers with access to programs that would allow them to spend essential time bonding with their infants. The IG also finds that access to feminine hygiene products inconsistent and inadequate. Some inmates were provided a uniform number of products, and when they asked permission to get more, they were denied this basic sanitary necessity. This is simply unacceptable. Strained resources at the Bureau of Prisons has been exacerbated by President Trump's hiring freeze and budget cuts. Over the past year, the Bureau of Prisons has cut thousands of staffing positions. Director Hurwitz, I apologize and I appreciate your commitment in implementing the IG's recommendations, but I know that for you to be able to correct the management challenges you're facing, you need adequate resources. Those resources should be used effectively and efficiently, not simply an outsourcing to contractors with little oversight or accountability for their actions. And I am deeply concerned by the sudden reversal by former Attorney General Sessions of the Obama administration's decision to phase out private prisons. The Obama administration made this decision after reports, including one by Mr. Horowitz, exposed dangerous health and public safety issues with the private prison system. Yet without any evidence of improved conditions or accountability, the Trump administration decided to put taxpayers back on the hook for an unsafe and broken system of private problems. In recent months, various Trump administration officials have voiced their support for investing resources into criminal justice reform. I hope we can work together in a bipartisan way to enact meaningful criminal justice reforms to truly reduce unnecessary mass incarceration. I do hope we can work together on this, and this may be our last meeting, who knows, and I just want to express my appreciation to the chairman for your efforts and for your work on this committee. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady from New York. Committee rules require me to swear the witnesses, which I neglected to do, so I would ask you to quickly stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give should be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God? May the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. With that, the gentleman from Ohio, Chairman Jordan.
I thank the chairman. Let me first pick up where the ranking member was just at. I want to thank the chairman for his outstanding service to the country over the last several years. In spite of wearing shirts like he's got on today, it's been amazing to work with him and appreciate his leadership. And I want to thank our witnesses, in particular Inspector General Horowitz. We've had a chance to talk many times. I'm going to focus on you and a different set of questions and the subject matter, if I could, and we'll see what you can respond with. But let me start with the press release that you issued on March 28, 2018. It says Inspector General Horowitz announced today that he will initiate a review that will examine the Justice Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation's compliance with legal requirements with applicable DOJ and FBI policies and procedures in applications filed with the U.S. Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court relating to a certain U.S. person. How is that, well, let me ask this. When do you expect that to be completed, Mr. Horowitz?
Congressman, we're making good progress on it. We're still in the interview phase. What I can say at this point is, given the volume of documents we've had and the number of witnesses it looks like we'll need to interview, we are likely to be in the same sort of general range of documents and witnesses as the last report we issued on the election review earlier this year. So wouldn't surprise me if we're in that million-plus range again of documents and
that took
100-ish or so interviewees.
Yeah.
The last review, as you know, took us about, what was it, 16 months or so to do. And the only thing I would remind people of, I know you know this, for example, the classified appendix, much of that information we learned earlier this year. Yep. Over a year.
You're talking midsummer?
I'm not going to put a date out there at this point, given where we are, but I'm happy to come up.
It's my understanding there's another investigation that's supposed to be going on the same subject matter by U.S. Attorney John Huber. Have you had any contact with Mr. Huber about his work, and how does that relate to yours?
I have had interactions with Mr. Huber. I think you'd need to talk to him about what the scope and what he's working on. As to him, I wouldn't begin to presume I know all of what he's necessarily working on, but we have had interactions on various information and matters over the last.
Can you give me an idea how often you've talked to him? Several meetings, several contacts?
Several contacts.
Because I mean, we've had zero. We don't know what he's doing. Mm-hmm. Literally do not know what he's doing since he was named months, 6, 7 months ago. We have no idea. I'd love to get an update, frankly, from him, but we don't have any idea.
Yeah, I've had, as I said, I've had several contacts with him, but I can't. I don't presume to speak for him.
Similar but slightly different issue. So a number of members, including the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, about 2 months ago called for the President of the United States to release certain information. The President initially indicated he was going to do that, and then shortly thereafter made a change and said he was going to run that decision through you. In fact, he tweeted out on September 21st of this year, I met with DOJ concerning the declassification of various unredacted documents, specifically 3 things that the chairman of the Intel Committee and many of us asked for: Bruce Orr 302s, certain portions of the FISA application that we were just discussing, and some exculpatory information that was presented to the so-called Gang of Eight. They agreed to release them, but stated that so doing may have a perceived negative impact on the Russia probe. Also, key allies called and asked not to release. Therefore, this is the operative language in the tweets, the Inspector General has been asked to review these documents on an expedited basis. I believe he will move quickly and hopefully often things which he is looking at, other things that he is looking at. In the end, I can always declassify if it proves necessary. Speed is very important to me. So this was 2 months ago. Can you give us any update on where that process is?
Yeah. We are looking at many documents that are obviously, pretty much all of them, highly classified. And as in all of our work on reviews where we're doing classified reviews related to the FBI, for example, we press for transparency. We press to put as much as we can in our reports. And I can tell you is we're going to do the same here and engage with the department's leadership and others and make sure that we put as much.
Let me just, one specific question, then I'll be done, Mr. Chairman, if I could. So there were sort of 3 key things we talked about: certain portions of the FISA application, 20-some pages, Mr. Orr's 302s, the records that the FBI makes when they interview an individual, and then information that was presented that Mr. Chairman Nunes has seen that was presented to the Gang of Eight. So have you looked at those 3 areas, and if so, when do you expect that you could make those available to the Congress?
I have access to all of those records in the review we're doing. In terms of when they would be available to Congress, I ultimately am not going to be the final decision maker, and I think that would be, frankly, a question.
If I could, Mr. Chairman, have you given any type of recommendation to the Commander-in-Chief? Because he's the one, the President's the one who said he wanted to do this as quickly as possible, and that was 2 months ago.
Yeah, I'm not in a position to talk about at this point. Congressman, let me think about that. Any internal discussions I may have had at this point. So I'd ask to get back to you on what I can do on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Ohio yields back the gentlelady from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, your report found, and I found it rather shocking, that the Bureau of Prisons institutions were not even able to make feminine hygiene products sufficiently accessible to female inmates. That seems like a very simple thing to do. And it described how several low-security prisons provided inmates with a predetermined number of products, regardless of need, just based on how many products they had available. Is that correct?
That's correct. We found it not necessarily at every institution, but as you indicated, at a number of institutions. And that was concerning to us as we wrote in the report. Since our report was out earlier this year, Director Hurwitz has issued a modified statement to make it clear that what should happen is, as we indicated, inmates shouldn't have to go asking for more product. They should be able to easily access it.
Well, I'm glad to hear that improvement, because that doesn't make sense at all on something so basically needed for feminine hygiene, not to even have the products available and have it predetermined by how many products you have. It seems really poor management. Now, you've corrected that in all institutions now?
Congressman, yes. All of our institutions that house female inmates clearly understand and have made available a number of feminine hygiene products at their request in the quantities that they each individually need. Each of the individual inmates has the option of getting as many as they need. There's no restrictions on how many they can have. There's no restrictions on, there's no rationing, and they're available in a central location for them rather than being in some locked cabinet where they have to ask for that.
Well, that's a step forward, because in reading the report, people were saying that they were not given the number that they needed. So, Director Hurwitz, do you think it is appropriate for prison counselors to deny the request of female inmates for these hygiene products?
Of course not, Congresswoman. It's never appropriate for that, and that's why we require that all of our staff make those products available. And we now go back and we verify it as well. We have two processes where our central office staff go out on site visits to verify and ensure that that's happening. And we have a new program review process, which is our internal auditing process, and the Inspector General commented on that as well, and we've made improvements in that area to ensure that that process goes on, and we go out and double check when we're there to make sure that, in fact, those products are available in the quantities.
Well, the Bureau of Prisons issued this new policy on feminine projects and products, but the IG's review found that it, and I'll quote, lacked specificity in how institutions should distribute the products, end quote. And is the Bureau of Prisons revising its manual to address this criticism from the IG?
Yes, ma'am. We're absolutely we're revising the manual and the policy to require that and to make it clear in the policy. But we've also do a number of steps to make sure that in the interim, until that policy gets issued, that those institutions are fully aware of the expectation that they do that. And again, we do that through regular meetings.
I tell you, the IG's report also indicated, and I found this interesting, that some state systems, correctional institutions, do a much better job than the federal system. Usually it's the federal system that has the high standards. So that was interesting that states had better ways of doing it. And that some states actually just make the products available upon request as needed. That seems common sense. And I would suggest that you follow that process. They have certain places that you can go and just as needed require it and ask for it. That seems like a good way to handle it. Mr. Hurwitz, based on your office research, did those states have any issues with inmates misusing feminine hygiene products?
No, we didn't find any issues in that regard.
Because it seems ridiculous that you wouldn't provide as much help to women as they needed. And it seems to me that this is just a matter of common respect for basic human dignity and I would say human need. So I would say that there's absolutely no reason that our federal prisons should be unable to provide feminine hygiene products to female inmates if they needed it upon request. And as I understand it now, that is your process. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, do you have places where they can go and request the products in the federal prisons now?
Yeah, they're available for them to access without having, in most cases, without even having to request it. It's available in a common area for them to get the numbers that they need.
Well, that's an improvement in management. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I yield back. My time is up.
The gentlelady from New York yields back. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized, Mr. Heiss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I may, let me also just say thank you for your service to our country and your powerful voice in this and other committees on which you've served. I think the gap you leave will be enormously huge and extremely difficult, if not impossible, to fill. So on behalf of myself and my constituents, thank you very much. Mr. Horowitz, always good to see you. Thank you for being here with us today. And you mentioned earlier there are some 36,000 employees at BOP, a huge number of individuals. No question there are some great workers, hardworking employees at BOP. We all acknowledge that. But the hard fact and reality is that there are also far too many bad actors who are there that really are disrupting the agency from within, all the way up and down the chain of command. That is extremely disturbing. and absolutely must be corrected. We've already heard today about the hearing we had back in December 2017, and since then we've received hundreds and hundreds of hearing from different employees and so forth, and much of all that has been substantiated, which creates an extremely disturbing situation. So again, thank you for being here. Let me begin by asking you, when you come across an agency that is so problematic, such as BOP, with mismanagement, misconduct so rampant it is systemic, what is the solution?
Well, one of the things that we try and do is both look at the individual issues of misconduct when we find them, but then try and step back, as you indicated, and look at the more systemic issues and what is the cause of that. And there are a few things that we want to make sure we can do. If need be, make recommendations to the BOP, but also the importance of accountability. Because I will say that there are thousands of employees at the BOP go to work in these prisons every day, whether they're correctional officers, doctors, psychologists, support staff, whatever position they're in. They don't want to work alongside people who are engaged in misconduct. It puts them at risk. It puts the inmates at risk. Sure. Makes an unsafe facility. So I think it's very important for the BOP, through its adjudication process, to hold people accountable when we find that, or they've found they engage in misconduct, and then make the systemic reforms that are needed to fix broader problems.
Well, and I agree, but that's the whole problem, is accountability. I mean, we already, for example, we already have laws against retaliation against whistleblowers. Right. And yet we know what's going on. So where's the accountability? Where is there? We can say there is accountability. We want accountability. But when we already have rules and laws in place and they are being ignored, swept under the rug, then there is no accountability. So is there something Congress needs to do more, or what consequences are in place for those who don't protect whistleblowers?
Well, I think there's two ways that Congress has created accountability. One is through creating independent inspectors general that do oversight, as we do. Congress holding hearings like this and others, like last December, to raise these issues. And then, finally ensuring that BOP management at the department are following through on the steps that they need to take to address these issues. I will say that from our standpoint, as an IG, we've seen considerable progress over the years with BOP, its management, in taking actions and addressing issues as we found them. Obviously, our goal is to prevent the issues rather than have to detect and refer them. I know that's, I'm sure, management's view as well at the department and the BOP, but that's very important.
So let me transition with that, Mr. Horowitz. You've got a big job ahead of you. How are you going to right this ship?
Thank you, sir. You're right. It's a big job, and the Inspector General is correct in as they identify these allegations come to us, we refer all those allegations through our own internal affairs office to the Inspector General, and the Inspector General's office, if they sustain findings, or even if they don't take the case and leave it with our internal affairs, if they sustain findings, then we take appropriate disciplinary action. And it begins with the investigative process. And there's really two bodies within the Department of Justice, in the Inspector General and our own Office of Internal Affairs, that are looking at these cases. And as these findings, many of them are not sustained, but when the cases are sustained, then I expect that we take disciplinary action appropriately.
Well, some are not sustained, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman, but the fact is there's a culture there that has to be changed. We're not just talking about dealing with a few instances of, there's an entire culture in BOP that must be changed, and that's where the responsibility is going to land on your shoulders, and we'll be keeping an eye on that. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia for his kind words, and the gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and let me join the other members of the committee in thanking you for your service, as well as your stylish shirts and hair. But so I appreciate serving with you, sir. Some of my colleagues have expressed concern that about resource limitations within the Bureau of Prisons, but Congress did put additional resources into supporting the prisons, particularly special housing units. What's happened in terms of implementation of that since that additional funding has been moved into the department?
Sir, and I very much appreciate the resources that Congress has provided to the Bureau of Prisons, and we're actively working to fill any vacant positions that we have. As a matter of fact, in the last 6 months, we've made 2,500 selections across the country.
Let me stop you real quick. The money came in 2016, the 2017-2018 budget. What percentage of those positions are filled?
From that particular budget, I do not know that, sir.
Rough percentage.
I do not know that. I'd have to have somebody look into that.
Well, if you would, and we give that back to the committee, I would appreciate it. And I have to tell you that I spent 35 years running a private business. Now, I admittedly not as large as the Bureau of Prisons, Lord knows. There are a few that probably are, but the reality is, in my opinion, sir, given the nature of the conversations we've had, you should know that. You should know where you're at in terms of staffing on key things where additional resources have been given to the Bureau of Prisons because of concerns that have arisen. So we know what's there, what's needed, especially something as urgent as having 2 correctional officers in high-security facilities at any point in time. It's to protect the employees and the inmates, frankly.
Well, I can tell you, we do have 2 correctional officers in all of our facilities at all times. And so if that's what your question is, that I can tell you with certainty that we are doing that and we have those in place.
Well, the question, to be more specific, was about the additional staffing that we provided.
That's what I thought generally is what you were asking. That's right, and I do not have the general number.
It appears to me one of the problems in the Bureau of Prisons goes beyond simply facilities, resources, programs, and even beyond simply how we maintain appropriate care of female inmates. And it's a cultural problem we have. It's a culture that's allowed employees, some employees, a handful, which is damaging, to do whatever they wish. My colleague asked earlier about accountability, how it is we hold them accountable, and we investigate them. What percentage of employees that are investigated end up with some kind of action taken by the department?
So the number of employees that are investigated, there's the vast number of investigations that take place, and the Inspector General may have information on this as well. Many of those individual investigations don't result in any kind of sustained findings. So I don't know how many of all the ones that were investigated, how many actually
How many did you have last year? How many complaints did you have last year?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
How many complaints did you have last year, sir?
The number of complaints, I do not know the number of complaints, sir. I know there's a significant number of complaints are filed, and they're investigated by either the Inspector General's office or our Office of Internal Affairs. I can tell you that as far as changing a culture, that is something that I'm very, very concerned about. And I've been acting this job since May, and I can't really speak to what my predecessors did or did not do, but we are working now, and I have set expectations for our leadership and for our staff on how to move forward. As a matter of fact, just last week, I issued a memo to all of them, setting forth very clearly my expectations.
Let me stop you. And you've inherited, and I acknowledge you've inherited a pretty ineffective and unfortunate culture there. I'm trying to find polite words for it. There's other words I would use in another setting. But the reality is accountability in part comes from, again, I come from the private sector. If you're found to commit sexual harassment of an employee, never mind an inmate that, in fact, Lord knows they don't have many rights as to exercise other than complain, the outcome in the private sector is you're unemployed. This isn't a discussion. This isn't a, if we have findings of that, you're unemployed. The reality is in the current system you have, it may or may not come forward, and frankly, there's multiple indications, you could help Mr. Horowitz, of whistleblowers failing to be protected by your department. What do we do about that?
Well, sir, my expectation is, first of all, it is completely unacceptable, any kind of sexual harassment or sexual abuse. And that is there is that is an unacceptable situation. And so my expectation, if there is a finding that is sustained involving, well, any sustained finding, there is going to be a disciplinary process take place. But something as severe as that, we're going to take the most harshest action
What is the disciplinary
available to
process?
us.
If you're found to be sexually harassing an employee or an inmate, what is the next step?
Well, after the investigation is complete, and if there's a finding that is sustained, then there's a recommendation to the deciding official as far as what the discipline should be. And there's a range of discipline that it could be, and it depends on the situation, the particular factors involved in that particular case.
Well, let me suggest that we addressed a similar problem in the Veterans Administration, in which veterans were being poorly treated, put on waiting lists, some died while waiting for care, and Congress passed the VA Accountability Act to address this, changing processes for holding people accountable, holding staff accountable for their job. I advocate we do the same thing with the Merit Act, that we change it to similar standards so that, in fact, you have the tools to hold people accountable, that it is unacceptable to have a culture that allows this kind of mismanagement, abuse of employees, abuse of inmates. It is unacceptable, and that's a cultural problem that has to be addressed, and it can't be addressed by saying, I'm sorry, you shouldn't do that. I'm sorry, you get 3 days off. There's some standards in our society we should have that it's unacceptable and you need to go away. So I'm going to advocate for that again next term if it doesn't pass out of the House this term, because we need to change that, and one way we change it is accountability. You have the tools to deal with it. I'm sorry I'm over my time, Mr. Chair, and I yield back. Thank you for your assistance. The
gentleman from Michigan yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Thank you. I see we have Mr. Horowitz here again. Committee chairman come and go, but we always have Mr. Horowitz. We have to remember, if one of us here is around long enough, I expect when he retires that he get a painting in this room. Okay, now on to the issues. I'm going to approach it from a little bit of a different tact here. I do have the Oxford Federal Prison right outside my district and several state prisons in my district. And when I talk about PREA, I think there's sometimes a forgotten person here. You know, everybody says, you know, we got all these out-of-control prison guards, we got to crack down on the prison guards. At least in my district, the vast majority of PREA complaints are, you know, frivolous. A lot of prisoners, and perhaps it's not surprising given the type of people who wind up prisoners and the fact that being a prisoner is kind of a boring life, I think they sit around and try to make lives miserable for the guards. And I was wondering what we're doing to make sure that the guards don't have any, what percentage of PREA complaints are you find meritless, and what are we doing to stop that?
Sir, the PREA complaints, again, like any other sort of sexual misconduct, whether it be for a staff member or an inmate, is absolutely unacceptable. And again, I mentioned earlier I mentioned direction that I sent out to all of our wardens. Our expectation is, again, a zero-tolerance policy. And I expect that if there are inmates acting in inappropriate behavior, that we take action against them as well. Sometimes that's difficult because the inmates, there's very little to deter the inmates because there's no federal crime associated with that activity. So we can discipline them. At most, they may get a misdemeanor, but that's a very difficult area because there's not a lot of deterrent for the inmates to not act up. That being said, it's a very small percentage of our inmates that actually do act up. I think it's less than 1%. That
by act up, do you mean commit a sexual assault or make a frivolous complaint?
No, I mean inmates that act in a sexually inappropriate behavior.
Okay. The point I'm trying to make is I have very many prison guards in my district. And, of course, PREA doesn't just affect the federal prisons. It affects the state prisons as well. It affects the county jails as well. Right. And not just in PREA, but anywhere across the board, given that some of these people are in prison for a long period of time, given that they come from a background in which they're not afraid to break the rules, so they wouldn't be in prison in the first place, sometimes their goal is to kind of make things miserable for the prison guards. And I wondered what you're doing about that, or the prison guards just have to put up with this forever?
No, I'm sorry, absolutely not. The prison guards aren't expected to put up with that. And And like I said, our expectation is that they will write up discipline against the inmate. If it's appropriate, it'll be turned over to the U.S. Attorney for prosecution. Like I said, unfortunately, there's not a lot of disincentive for the inmates to not do that because there's no federal, significant federal crime.
How often, say in the last 2 or 3 years, and I guess we're getting kind of off the thing here, but I'm not the one who went down this path, how often have we disciplined any inmates, as far as you're concerned, for making something up just to irritate a guard?
I think that happens fairly often, probably on a regular basis.
We discipline the inmates?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd like to know how often it happens. Okay, how much are we, a couple other questions here. What is our cost per inmate in the prison system for a year?
The cost per inmate, you know, I have that here. I don't remember off the top of my head, but our cost per inmate is about, as a whole, if you look at all of our security levels, because the higher security levels are more costly than the lower, but the average across the whole is just under $100 per day.
Okay, so like about $36,000 a year. And I know you always need more guards, or I assume you need more guards, just because in our society we have a shortage of people to do anything under the sun, correct? Do you know your compensation in general in federal prison compared to state prisons?
Generally, our compensation is pretty good. There are some states, California is an example, that does pay higher. But generally, compared to most states, our compensation is better.
Can I just,
Sure.
on that point, Congressman just mentioned, that's true as to the BOP's own correctional officers and employees. It's not necessarily true with regard to the federal contract prisons. We actually did a report on a contract facility where the contract prison was paying not only far less than the BOP for its correctional officers, but also from what the state was paying, which was an issue we identified in the contract prison report that caused us concern about how the BOP was overseeing its own contract prisons, because they were hiring individuals that could not get a job or qualify for a job with the BOP.
So in other words, sometimes when they have private prisons, the reason they have private prisons is they just hire people for far less who aren't as good.
Then they would not meet the qualifications.
Or at least not meet the
standards
qualifications, whether the qualifications are necessary.
They wouldn't meet the qualification standards and would get far less pay.
Okay. Thank you much. I've used up my 5 minutes.
The gentleman from Wisconsin yields back. The gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized. Chairwoman Fox.
I'm a huge fan, and you will be a tremendous loss to us, but I know you'll continue to serve in places where you think that's appropriate, so thank you very much. Mr. Hurwitz, one of my questions is, how often do inmates enter or leave the special housing unit or come in contact with the public?
I think if you mean come in contact with the public, meaning that they're outside of our facilities, generally our inmates are not in contact with the public unless they are our lowest security inmates, often usually at a minimum security camp. Sometimes they go out on community service projects from those camps. That does happen on occasion. Sometimes they're in contact with the public if public come to the institution and they may be outside the institution cleaning the grounds or whatever. Inmates at higher level security facilities generally do not come in contact with the public. There are some situations where they may receive a furlough under our furlough policy and would potentially come in contact with the public because they would be sent out that way as well. While they're in our custody. Now, inmates then eventually may be released to a residential reentry center. They're still in our custody, and of course they would come into contact with the public on a very regular basis because they're in the community in that case.
I'm sorry if I missed this earlier, and you may have said it, but what percentage of BOP staff is female?
The BOP staff female is around, our female staff are about 27%.
And what percentage of those are in direct contact with inmates? I mean, you may have, what percentage of that staff is administrative and never come in contact with an inmate?
Right. I don't know the exact number there. Most of them, though, work in the institutions, and all of our staff that work in institutions come in contact with inmates on a daily basis.
Okay. The OIG's report recommended establishing a specific female post at prisons with female inmates. Do you agree with this recommendation, and explain why? And if you do agree with it, what have you done to take action on it?
Thank you, ma'am. We agreed with the recommendations from of each of the recommendations that the OIG issued. In terms of staffing, female staffing in certain posts, we're looking into right now different options on how to make female staff more available to do searches and things like that, which was the basis of the IG's finding, to ensure that we can meet those needs rather than having female staff having to go across the compound, for example, to perform a search, things like that. So we're looking at different options to find a way to do that, and then once we figure that out, we'll be issuing a new policy to put that in place, and we'll be reporting to the IG at the end of the month with our status on that.
Mr. Horowitz, if there aren't specific female posts filled, do you have any additional recommendations for this issue since your report has been made?
Well, I think it is a significant challenge because, as we found when we went on site and did this review, it creates disruption to the entire prison system when female inmates need to be searched coming back from a visitation or in a SHU, in a special housing unit, as you indicated, Congresswoman, and pulling the staff off makes little sense. Now, the problem is posts were designed based on seniority as opposed to needs, specific needs, and so that has to change. The alternative is to hire more female correctional officers and staff to do that, but that, frankly, would be, in some respects, inefficient. The better way to do it is to figure out the inefficiency and address it and not spend more money unless it's absolutely needed.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from North Carolina yields back, and I thank her for her kind words. I want to reiterate what the gentlelady from New York said. This is an unusual day. There are leadership races. There's no good day to have leadership races. Let me say that again. There's no good day to have leadership races. We had ours a couple of weeks ago. So I know y'all won't do this, but I feel the need to say it. Please do not take from the fact that folks aren't here that they're not interested and appreciative of both of your works. It's just an unusual day, and the alternative is to cancel the hearing, which is not good too. So with that, you guys are experts. You understand more about the Federal Bureau of Prisons than nearly anyone else. But for those who do not, for those who may be watching or are just curious, what are the challenges? Director Hurwitz, for most of us, when we mess up in life, they threaten to punish you or send you to prison. That's not a really good threat when you're already there. So how do you manage, from a discipline standpoint, what are the challenges of managing people who are already in the place that most of us least want to go?
Well, sir, you're absolutely right. That is one of the biggest challenges that we face, particularly at the higher security level institutions, because certainly inmates at a lower security institution have an incentive to get along because we can move them to a higher security institution and they lose a lot of privileges and freedoms the higher up they go. So certainly the bigger challenge is at our higher security facilities. We have a tremendous staff who do this every day, and they work next to those inmates every day, and they try very hard to make sure they manage in a professional manner to earn the respect of those inmates and to make sure that we can ensure that the inmates continue to behave. That's partly by disciplining them, We do have restrictive housing. We try to use that only when it's absolutely necessary, but an inmate can go to restrictive housing. We can move them to other units as well, and we work to take away, and we'll take away other privileges. They can reduce visitation, which is generally very important to inmates, phone minutes, things like that. But you're absolutely right. The higher it gets in our security levels, the harder it is for our staff to manage those inmates. And those are among the worst inmates in this country. I mean, we need to remember, and I think as you pointed out, we are dealing with some of the most serious and significant felons that this country, or quite frankly the world, knows. And they're very dangerous. And at the highest levels.
Some of them are really dangerous, and they're really creative. And if they had directed those energies towards lawful pursuits, they'd be really, really wealthy. There's some really, really smart, really, really dangerous people. So just focusing on the maximum security prisons, you mentioned visitation. If you're already in a maximum facility, you can't be bumped up. So in terms of discipline, controlling the conduct within that facility, you've got visitation. What are your other tools? You can't deny them access to their lawyer. You can't deny them food. You can't do all the things my grandmother did to me to correct my behavior. So what can you do?
Well, again, our staff are trained to work with the inmates to make sure that they ensure there is an understanding and that the inmates respect those staff members. These inmates do have to live there too. So, you know, they take away their privileges. They will put them in special housing if they do the worst things they can. We can refer them to the Inspector General and ultimately to the U.S. Attorney's Office for prosecution if those inmates are doing something that is illegal.
You're serving a life without parole sentence. I'm not sure how much the U.S. Attorney's Office scares you.
Absolutely, sir. There is limit.
Can you still use solitary confinement?
We have restrictive housing units that we use. People often refer them as solitary confinement. They're generally 2 to a cell, so I don't look at it as solitary. But we do put inmates in restrictive housing and use that. We try and use that only when it's necessary, but absolutely, we still use restrictive housing.
Well, let me finish by asking you this. There's a guy named Brian Sterling in South Carolina. He was a prosecutor. He was chief of staff for now Ambassador Haley. He was a first-year law student, so he's had some really, really tough gigs in life. He's now the director of corrections. Yes, it's far and away the hardest job he's ever had. It is, you really only make the news if something terrible happens. So how do you recruit? I.G. Horowitz just mentioned recruitment. How do you recruit and how do you retain when it is, by most estimates, the toughest job in the justice system?
You know, sir, I appreciate the characterization as the toughest job in criminal justice, because I agree with you. And we recruit, we send out our staff, we go to recruitment fairs, we try and explain to folks what we do. We have benefits such as law enforcement retirement and benefits like that that are attractive to people. Recruiting is right now, with our staffing levels, that's one of the most important things that we're doing in trying to recruit new staff. It's especially challenging in some of the places we have prisons, because not all of our prisons are in places that people want to move to or live in, because many of them are in rural areas, and unless you're from that area, people don't necessarily want to move to that area. As we discussed earlier, we do pay better than most of the states in this area, so there is benefits there as well.
We have a federal prison in Estill, South Carolina, and we used to joke that we needed to keep people from breaking into the prison because there's just more to do in the prison than there is in Estill, South Carolina. So I get the challenge. Doesn't minimize what the IG has found, and I know you're going to work on it, but make sure the folks at the BOP know that we're aware of how difficult the job is and how appreciative we are, even on days when they don't make the news. So with that, thank you on behalf of all of the members, those present and those who are not, for appearing today. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks for any member to submit a written opening statement or questions for the record. There's no further business. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.